The man who walked into the bank that morning didn't look like much. If you'd taken a moment to study him, you wouldn't have seen anything special. Just another ragged-looking guy coming in off the street. And so as he entered the bank, that large old building in Spokane, Washington, in the fall of 1988, nobody paid him any attention. And those who did weren't too happy with what they saw. The man's name was John Barrier, and he was dressed in ragged, torn clothing. He had a beat-up old work boots on his feet and grease stains and mud on his jacket. He looked like he'd just gotten off work at a construction site, or maybe spent the night sleeping under a bridge, or maybe both. John approached the bank teller, who was dressed in a well-tailored pinstriped suit. And the teller looked this new client up and down disapprovingly. John first proffered a small check to cash, and then asked if the teller could maybe do him the favor of validating his parking, which would cost about 50 cents. The teller explained to John that he had to make an actual transaction to get the parking validated, and cashing such a small check was not a real transaction, giving the haughty glance at this scruffy-looking man standing in front of him. He looked me up and down and stood back and gave me one of those kinds of looks, John Barrier later said to the newspaper when they got wind of what would happen next. And I said, fine. If you don't need me, then I don't need you. And so John Barrier told the teller that he was done with this particular bank and he would like to close his account. The teller obliged, and then his jaw nearly hit the floor when he looked at Barrier's checking account balance, which was well north of $1 million. John Barrier took his check for more than $1 million down the street to the next bank he could find, who happily opened a 7-figure checking account for him, which just goes to prove the point, as Barrier would later tell his hometown newspaper, if you have $1 in the bank or $1 million, I think they owe you the courtesy of stamping your parking ticket. We all make judgments about people, don't we? We make judgments about people's appearance, about their dress, about the wealth they may or may not have. We make judgments about their behavior, their family dynamics, their physical and emotional attributes. But often, far too often, our judgments are wrong. We may not know they're wrong, we may never see the truth of how they're wrong, but people are far more complex than a 10-second appraisal from across a room would ever reveal. The bank teller saw a homeless man when he was actually looking at a millionaire. He got it wrong. And yet we make judgments anyway. Jesus' parable from the gospel this morning would strongly encourage us to do the opposite. In the story, the farmer scatters good wheat out in the field, and then at night an enemy comes and sows that field with weeds as well. The problem is that the farmer cannot simply uproot the weeds without pulling up the wheat, too. The good and the bad are inseparable as long as they're in the field together, as long as they're growing. How can you tell the difference when they're just some green shoots? Notice that there's definitely judgment that's going to happen in this story, in this parable, but please notice who is it that does the judging. It's not human beings who have that right. It's God alone, the farmer of the parable. The entire point of this story is that during this life, it doesn't do good to pass judgment on our fellows because we cannot separate the wheat from the weeds. We can't tell the difference, and trying to separate them will only damage the wheat. Notice how the servants even petition the farmer to, go out and separate them one from another. Then do you want us to go and gather them in, they asked. But he replied, no, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow. Did you hear that? Let both of them grow until the harvest. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles, but gather the wheat into my barn. This is, of course, the same Jesus, folks, who said in the same gospel, do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure that you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Why then, if Jesus is so strongly opposed to judgmental ways of treating one another, are Christians, and I hate to say this, so strongly associated with judgment? Authors of the recent and pointedly titled book called Why Nobody Goes to Church Anymore, which I've read with staff in the past in other churches, interviewed and polled people about their experiences at churches and their opinions of churchgoers. A young woman told us that as a child she regularly attended church, but she's given up on the church as an adult because they make me feel like an outcast, she said. Why, we asked. Well, I'm a smoker, she said. In fact, when polled, 87% of Americans said that Christians are judgmental. I don't like that one bit. That troubling number reflects a public perception of the church as being a refuge of holier-than-thou busybodies. But in my opinion, nothing could be further from the truth. But that's nonetheless a stigma that the church itself has often had a hand in creating. Like John Barrier's experience at the bank teller, the church can sometimes turn its collective noses up at those who look different from us or whose motives and allegiances we disagree with. Let me ask you if you've ever felt judged in a church. You probably have. I can remember back when I was a child, there was a Presbyterian church elder in a church that I attended who just went nearly apoplectic one time because I received communion. You weren't supposed to do that until you were an adult. I didn't know differently. And I can remember a Pentecostal church that I attended when I was a kid that exiled me to another room during a children's service because I had been talking to somebody in the pews. For many people, experiences of rejection or separation like these might have been the end of their experience with the church. Fortunately, I had some really, really good experiences as well. But despite negative ones, I love and adore what the church can be at its very best, because it can be an incredible place at its best. A place of welcoming community. We saw that here last night. A place of refreshment and renewal. A place of spiritual riches and peace beyond all understanding. And those are the gifts that we should be sharing. Let me try and state this as definitively as I know how to do. The church is not and has never been a place for people who have everything figured out. Jesus himself said, I did not come for the righteous, I came for sinners. And you may notice that I repeat that a lot in a lot of the sermons that I give because it's profound. I think it's one of the most amazing things that Christ taught. I didn't come for the righteous. We're not a museum for saints to be put on display wearing halos and carrying harps. We are a hospital for sinners. For real people with real lives and real problems in those lives. And frankly, folks, there are no other kinds of people, right? As Pope Francis put it quite eloquently a couple years ago, he said he sees the church as a field hospital after a battle. The church is the place where we go after the battle of life, knowing that there is no battle that leaves somebody without scars. Both physical and mental and spiritual. You and I are both among the wounded, and we are here to see the greatest physician of all, Jesus Christ. It's not our job to separate the wheat from the weeds. In trying to tear out weeds as self-appointed judge and jury, we will inevitably do damage to the wheat. This is what happens when the church becomes a guardian of purity instead of a refuge place for people who need to heal. In that first model, what you end up with is the Salem witch trials, right? In the second one, the model that Jesus actually promotes, you get something much more like Florence Nightingale, who healed people from both sides of the conflict, regardless. Jesus is saying that the responsibility of judgment ultimately belongs to God alone. God is the final arbiter of justice and the beginning and end of all things. And let's be honest about this for a moment. The truth is that no one is entirely wheat or entirely weeds, right? Nobody is. We each have a bit of both in us commingled together. Some days I have some wheat in me. Some days I think I'm nothing but thorns. You know those days. Maybe in a deeper sense, we're more like that field itself where both end up growing together until God intervenes, until the harvest, when all things will be put right once more. When John Barrier walked into the bank that day, he was treated like a homeless man that he might have appeared to be. But when he closed his account and went next door, he was treated like the millionaire he was. Our accounts are not figured in dollars, but in spiritual riches of a greater sort. And my hope is that this community is and will remain a place that treats people without the judgment that they find in other parts of their lives. A place that treats people as if they were Christ himself, who took on the lowest of forms to be like us in order to reveal the greatest of all glory, which is the love and glory of God. And so let our prayer be, Holy Lord, guide this community to treat others with love and respect at all times, and surrender judgment to your will and in your time. In your holy name, amen.